the adventure game Firewatch, which was developed by Campo Santo, whatever, features its fair share of hair-raising, suspenseful scenes. Sequences, like when you're attacked from behind, or you realize that someone is in your lookout tower, are fantastically executed and create a well-structured sense of intensity. Strangely, the further I went into the virtual Wyoming wilderness, the more flashbacks I had to the 2012 horror hit from Parsec Productions, Slender: The 8 Pages. At first glance, the comparison seemed superficial. Both games are played from a first-person perspective and largely take place in forests, but it got me thinking, how do these games create tension in their own ways? And for this video, I'm also going to be using footage and notes from 2013's expanded sequel to The 8 Pages, Slender: The Arrival. Let's start with Firewatch. The game uses a carefully constructed chronology to show exactly what's necessary, mostly skipping the boring realities of a national parks lookout and getting straight to the juicy mystery elements. Campo Santo amplifies the plot's more unsettling elements by lighting with dramatic flair, using panicked voice acting,
"Oh my god, what the fuck is happening, Henry?"
and a fitting soundtrack.
Oh, shit.
While the game has a large amount of open area for the player to explore, and the player's dialogue choices have a few narrative results, in reality, the developers built the primary in-game narrative with little to no room for variation. The only important variable truly under the player's control is the time it takes them to actually progress through the game and activate scripted sequences. Because it can't really change, the construction of tension in Firewatch is static. And then we have Slender, which focuses more on outright terrifying the player. And some of the methods used to build tension in the Slender games fall more into the category of dynamic, using sudden outbursts of overpowering sound effects and screen distortion. The design of both The 8 Pages and The Arrival has an easier time of eliciting jump scares from the player. But said scares don't occur right away. The games use plenty of devices for build-up. Most notably, the escalating soundtrack, which, in my opinion, is one of the two elements that elevates The 8 Pages from primitive indie schlock into a well-crafted horror game. With each 2 collected pages, or alternatively, the passage of time if the player isn't fast enough, the soundtrack becomes increasingly ominous, beginning with a simple thumping sound, then adding something akin to ears ringing, introducing a hiss, and ending with a more rhythmic addition that sounds like a theme from a slasher movie. It's hard to convey just how effective this is if you haven't actually played The 8 Pages, but it's another in a long series of examples that shows just how much sound design can dramatically change the effect a game has on the player. However, I hesitate to call this dynamic, because it's still a highly scripted reaction to player input, and Firewatch uses similarly foreboding sound cues in its darker scenes. But the second element of Slender that makes it so effective is the pattern of the Slender Man himself, and that's what really separates this game from Firewatch. While Slendy follows a few rules, his movements are largely randomized. He could appear right in front of you, behind you, off to the side. Basically, his superpower is being anywhere. He can also briefly turn your screen to static for a quick shock. His placement and dramatic sound cue upon seeing him can make for some great genuine scares. This hard-to-predict enemy design was intentional. In an interview with Mark Hadley, creator of The 8 Pages, he summed up his mentality quite simply, quote, "In games with scripted events, the event might get you the first time, but you'll expect it on subsequent playthroughs. Make it random, and you can never be sure." Admittedly, the randomness can prove frustrating, as it creates a large dependence on luck to complete the game, but in simply creating tension, Slender excels thanks to the element of chance resulting in more unique playthroughs. The particular scene of Firewatch that sparked my renewed interest in Slender was this.
Sounds good. Check in when you can, and keep an eye out for anyone following you.
Hearing that in my first playthrough, I was on the edge of my seat. But it occurred to me a short time later that there was no chance of actually encountering my pursuer. And a second playthrough of Firewatch works much like a repeat viewing of a movie. While you can still admire how that tension is constructed, it's unlikely to inspire that same feeling in you. With all that said, it would seem that dynamic tension is always better for an interactive medium. But that's a gross oversimplification, and doesn't do well-made games like Firewatch any justice. Tension built on dynamic elements has its own problems. Dynamic elements have to consistently maintain variety. And yes, I'm aware of the oxymoron that is consistent variety. But I'm a sucker for contradictions. In the case of the Slender games, Slender Man has the ability to appear at any location on the map, but that's really all he can do. After appearing and distorting the camera so many times, the player faces diminishing returns. When playing The Arrival for this video, I played with a few friends, and in our lengthy search for the 8th page, we encountered the Slender Man numerous times, but it never frightened us after the first few encounters. We found the act of looking for the last page so dull, to the point that we just got caught to end our boredom. The next section of Arrival did spice things up a bit with an enemy that actually runs after the player, which combined with Slendy brings the tension back up, at least until the player becomes just as used to the new enemy as they were with Slender Man, after which, same issues as before. This is sort of an if you give a mouse a cookie problem. You have to continue to make the game more unpredictable, or the player will look for something else to hold their interest. A focused and well-written story can help make up for the lack of variety, which games based on static tension have an easier time providing. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention two more elements that are randomized at the beginning of several Slender stages: the location of collectible items, and the starting location of the player. These make certain the player can't form one perfect strategy, but once again it comes with downsides. Much like knowing that Slender Man can't do more than stand and stare, the environment can eventually be mapped out, and not just by online guides. In the 8 pages, the player will likely realize early on that the bathroom and oil tanks are close together, meaning in another playthrough, they'll already know where to go next after exploring one of them. With the page collecting missions, the developers chose to place the pages on distinct landmarks rather than random trees. But this forces every landmark to universally make sense, page or no page. To use a probably cliche hypothetical to explain what I mean, imagine a wall with numerous arrows painted in blood, all pointing at one particular spot. This wouldn't make any sense if the game doesn't place a page there. So while page locations can be distinct, they can never be too detailed and make use of careful build-up. Without the knowledge that the player will experience the game in a mostly predetermined way, a game's tension that's built on dynamic elements can feel kind of clumsy. Meanwhile, careful construction of intensity can lead to more memorable and impactful moments in a story, because the developer already knows in exquisite detail how the player must progress through the narrative and can plan accordingly. My conclusion here might seem a bit anticlimactic, like getting all 8 pages and still losing, but there's no one right answer for how to build tension in a video game. Static and dynamic elements both have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to the developer to decide which matters more. And of course, games can and very often use both. Firewatch's dialogue choices can lead to more heightened, nervous responses, which can affect the player's interpretation of the plot, and the Slender games make use of static elements for tension as well, such as the scream after collecting a particular letter in Arrival's first house. But I have a feeling games like Slender and Firewatch will continue to grow in popularity, and if a developer is aiming for high intensity, at least in terms of how the player feels, they strongly need to consider which method suits their idea best. Duh, right? But still, whatever. Thank you so much for watching, and here is a cliche please like and subscribe message. Please like and subscribe. And hey, if you think I'm completely wrong, please let me know in the comments. Or hey, maybe you actually agree with me and want to tell me what a good job I did. Please feel free to leave a comment about that too. This is Tanner from Tricky Hitbox. Until next time.